April 1945. The gates of Ravensbrück stand open for the first time in years. The morning air is heavy with ash, disinfectant, and the smell of wet earth. Women, hollow-eyed, wrapped in blankets, bones beneath skin, step cautiously into the pale sunlight. They do not cheer. They look at the sky, unsure if they're allowed to. American relief trucks rumble in. Among the crates of bread and medical kits, there are boxes that seem strangely out of place. Books. Worn novels, magazines, small prayer books, even a few children's stories. One woman stares as a soldier lays them on a table. "Any of these," he says simply. She reaches for one with trembling hands, a volume of Goethe, pages yellowed but whole. Another chooses an English newspaper, tracing each word as if rediscovering language itself. For years, their minds were starved as much as their bodies. Now the quiet rustle of paper feels like oxygen, and that single moment of turning a page marked the beginning of their return to humanity. By early 1945, Europe was a continent of ruin. The Third Reich was crumbling, its cities burned and its armies retreating on every front. Yet behind the front lines, thousands of prison compounds still held the broken remains of an empire of forced labor. Among them stood Ravensbrück, the largest concentration camp built specifically for women. More than 130,000 women had passed through its gates since 1939. Political prisoners, resistance fighters, nurses, teachers, mothers, and teenage girls pulled from occupied Europe. The camp's purpose was not simply punishment. It was control. Every letter, every word, every thought had been policed. Reading unauthorized material could mean beating, isolation, or death. German overseers and SS guards considered intellectual freedom an enemy weapon. Paper itself was dangerous. Beyond Germany, similar camps dotted occupied territory: Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Theresienstadt, Gross-Rosen, and dozens more. In each, women fought to preserve fragments of humanity, whispered poems, remembered stories, scraps of paper hidden under straw. By the winter of 1944-45, the outside world finally began to close in. The Red Army was advancing from the east, the Western Allies from the west. Nazi authorities evacuated camps, sending prisoners on brutal death marches toward central Germany. In that chaos, records were burned, libraries destroyed, and the last vestiges of Nazi censorship were enforced with bullets. Yet the same movement that brought destruction also carried relief. The slow approach of Allied military intelligence, Red Cross envoys, and humanitarian organizations that had been planning for this moment for years. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were entitled to intellectual relief, the right to read, write, and receive books from neutral nations. The International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, had kept that clause alive even during the darkest years. Through Swiss warehouses, neutral ships, and diplomatic pouches, it sent more than 1 million books into Axis and Allied camps alike. But for civilian inmates in concentration camps, the situation was entirely different. The Nazis recognized no such rights. For them, intellectual relief was subversion. Still, whispers of hope existed. In Britain and America, librarians and volunteers launched the Victory Book campaign, collecting over 10 million books to supply soldiers, POWs, and later, liberated civilians. The American Library Association, the YMCA, and the U.S. War Department coordinated shipments of reading material through the Red Cross for verified POW camps. The intention was simple yet profound, that even in captivity, the human mind should not be a prisoner. By early 1945, as Allied armies crossed the Rhine and pushed into northern Germany, those same channels of supply began redirecting toward humanitarian relief for liberated territories. Truck convoys carried not only food and medicine, but also crates labeled books and educational material. Many soldiers never knew they were hauling small libraries destined for displaced persons, camps, hospitals, and rehabilitation centers that had yet to be built. When the Swedish Red Cross organized the White Buses missions in March 1945, rescuing Scandinavian and later French, Polish, and other prisoners from German camps, each vehicle carried medical supplies, food, and occasionally cultural material requested by the ICRC, paper, pencils, and reading matter. For the women on board, it was the first sign that the outside world still valued knowledge and words. Meanwhile, inside Ravensbrück, Disease and starvation reached catastrophic levels. Prisoners no longer counted the days by sunrise but by rumors that the Allies were coming, that trucks were approaching, that freedom might mean death on the road or life in an unknown camp. In that vacuum of certainty, the idea of a book, a text untouched by propaganda, became a kind of dream. Many women remembered the last thing they had read before arrest: a banned newspaper, a school textbook, a letter. The thought that words might exist beyond Nazi control seemed impossible, yet far beyond those barbed wire fences, a quiet infrastructure of moral resistance was ready. The Red Cross and Allied commands had prepared educational divisions to operate immediately after liberation. They called them Civil Affairs and Psychological Warfare Units, paradoxical names for teams that would soon distribute reading material instead of leaflets. When the gates finally fell, that machinery of relief rolled in almost instantly, and for the women who had survived years of forced silence, the sudden permission to read anything was as shocking as the freedom itself. The question now was how such a simple act, the opening of a book, could carry so much historical weight, and what made the Allies insist on it even amid chaos. By the final weeks of the war, the German state was dissolving from within. Trains carrying prisoners no longer reached their destinations. Fuel was gone, command lines fractured. In this twilight of authority, thousands of women were abandoned along roads, in barns, and in half-empty camps. When Allied scouts reached the first concentration compounds, they found not battlefields but graveyards. Bergen-Belsen, liberated by the British on April 15, 1945, was described by witnesses as a wasteland of corpses and silence. Ravensbrück, north of Berlin, was discovered soon after by units of the Red Army and Swedish Red Cross envoys. At Theresienstadt, Czech partisans met the Soviet advance amid famine and disease. Each camp revealed the same paradox. Life had survived, but barely. The Allied response was immediate and improvisational. Field hospitals were erected within days. Quarantine zones were drawn with chalk lines. Food was rationed to avoid killing survivors through shock refeeding. And alongside medical and logistical officers came another, lesser-known presence: education and morale teams carrying crates of paper, pencils, and books. These units were not an afterthought. Since 1943, Allied planners in London and Washington had debated how to handle post-liberation civilians. The Civil Affairs Division, KAD, and Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAF, had already developed psychological rehabilitation plans. They understood that once the fighting ended, millions of displaced persons would need not only shelter, but a way to reconnect with meaning, something to read, something to learn, something that proved the world beyond the barbed wire still existed. In Geneva, the International Committee of the Red Cross kept up parallel efforts. Its Intellectual Relief Division, founded in 1939, had already supplied POWs across Europe with literature. Their mission statement read, "To preserve the human spirit through access to knowledge." They sent books in multiple languages: French, Polish, English, Czech, Russian, often negotiated through neutral embassies. By 1945, they were preparing for the day when those shipments could go directly into liberated zones. Yet, the reality of delivery was chaotic. In the ruins of Germany, distribution networks collapsed. Paper was scarce. The Allied military government requisitioned warehouses, sorting whatever printed material had survived bombings, confiscated libraries, abandoned university archives, even propaganda presses now under Allied control. From these ruins, teams began reassembling clean reading stock, textbooks, novels, dictionaries, religious texts, stripped of Nazi imagery. For many liberated women, this sudden access to uncensored reading was the first visible sign that the ideology of control had been broken. During the war, German propaganda had controlled every written word. Unauthorized reading could lead to punishment. To hold a book again without fear was to reclaim individuality. Eyewitness accounts collected by relief workers described disbelief more than joy. One Polish survivor at Ravensbrück recalled that when a Red Cross nurse offered her a German novel, she refused at first, convinced it was a test, that reading could still be a crime. Only after watching others freely exchange books did she allow herself to touch one. Another, a French resistance courier, later said, I had not seen a page of print that wasn't Nazi for 4 years. The first free sentence I read, I cried. In parallel, American POW camps for Axis soldiers in France, Britain, and the U.S. implemented similar reading freedoms. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, and the Allies took that to mean full intellectual access. German POWs could read Goethe, Shakespeare, even banned democratic literature. The contrast was striking. While Nazi camps had extinguished the written word, American policy reinstated it as a tool of re-education. This mirrored a broader Allied ideal, that freedom of thought was as essential as freedom of movement. Every crate of donated books was a declaration that knowledge itself was no longer restricted by race, creed, or command. By May 1945, as German forces surrendered, the distribution expanded rapidly. Displaced persons camps in Lübeck, Hanover, Munich, and Paris began receiving organized shipments through the Red Cross and Allied information services. In the first weeks, many survivors could barely hold books. Malnutrition and typhus left them too weak. But relief officers noted a rapid change. Those who read, even briefly, showed improved morale, focus, and willingness to engage with rehabilitation efforts. In those fragile beginnings of post-war Europe, education became the first act of reconstruction. The women who had once been forbidden to read now became the first students of liberation. Some would later teach languages in refugee schools, translate for Allied authorities, or rebuild local libraries from memory. Freedom in its simplest form had begun not with weapons, but with words. Angle 1, the human dimension, minds that survived. For many of the women liberated from Nazi camps, the freedom to read was not simply leisure. It was survival in a new form. Their bodies were emancipated first, but their minds still lived in captivity. Starvation, trauma, and years of indoctrination had created a vacuum where thought once thrived. The arrival of books, unguarded, uncensored, unmonitored, filled that vacuum with something almost spiritual. Relief officers recorded scenes of disbelief. In April 1945 at Bergen-Belsen, a British Army nurse wrote that when she placed a small stack of magazines in the hospital ward, the women touched them as if they were fragile relics. One survivor read the same article 5 times, tracing the printed letters with her finger, whispering each word. To her, the English language itself was a promise that civilization still existed. Others gravitated toward school books and dictionaries. Reading helped them remember who they had been: teachers, students, writers, mothers. It rebuilt identity in a world where names had been replaced by numbers. Psychologists attached to Allied medical teams soon recognized a pattern. Those who engaged in reading recovered emotional stability faster. The act of interpretation, of making sense of a page, reignited cognitive processes long suppressed by fear. To modernize, it may seem a small gesture. But to a woman who had risked her life for reading a banned pamphlet, the simple phrase, "Read anything you like," was the loudest proclamation of liberty she could imagine. Angle 2, the tactical and logistical effort. Books as cargo of freedom, behind those fragile pages stood an immense logistical structure. In 1944, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Western Europe, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHEF, formed a small but vital office under its Civil Affairs Division, the Information Services Control, ISC. Its mission, to destroy Nazi propaganda and replace it with free press, libraries, and educational material, was as strategic as it was moral. After the liberation of each camp or city, ISC officers followed combat units, cataloging available literature. Warehouses full of propaganda were sealed or destroyed. Neutral or pre-war texts were salvaged. Trucks already carrying rations often included secondary cargo. Crates marked printed matter. These were distributed to military hospitals, DP, displaced persons camps, and relief centers run by organizations like the Red Cross and the United Nations, Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA. Transporting books into devastated regions was a logistical nightmare. Roads were cratered, rail lines destroyed, fuel nearly non-existent. Yet officers insisted on it. In April and May 1945, British and American supply officers worked with Red Cross couriers to divert shipments from POW libraries in Switzerland, toward liberated camps in Germany and Austria. In some cases, soldiers simply donated their own books. Each crate became a quiet symbol of reversal. Just months earlier, the German Ministry of Propaganda had burned or banned millions of titles across Europe. Now Allied trucks carried those same kinds of books, banned authors, Jewish writers, democratic thinkers, back into the heart of the Reich. This effort was not purely sentimental. Allied planners understood that information control had been a cornerstone of totalitarian power. To rebuild Europe, they had to re-establish intellectual circulation. Thus, reading freedom became both humanitarian and tactical. It dismantled the psychological architecture of Nazism from the inside. Angle 3, the technological and cultural layer. What books were chosen? The first libraries to reach liberated women were unlike any before. They were assembled from chaos, a mixture of whatever survived. Lists from Allied and Red Cross archives show the variety. Goethe, Dickens, Tolstoy, the Bible, French poetry, English magazines, nursing manuals, grammar books, and simple storybooks. Printing technology also played a role. Portable presses, originally used for field orders and leaflets, were repurposed to produce small runs of educational material. The U.S. Army's Special Services Division printed pocket-sized books known as Armed Services Editions, lightweight enough for field distribution. After the liberation, surplus copies of these, from Steinbeck to Shakespeare, were handed to displaced civilians. Language was another challenge. The women came from dozens of nations. Translators, teachers, and multilingual relief workers began organizing informal reading circles. A single Polish-English dictionary might circulate among 20 readers. A Czech woman fluent in German would read aloud to others, translating as she went. The content mattered less than the act. Some women requested religious texts. Others wanted newspapers or technical manuals. The diversity itself symbolized the antithesis of Nazi uniformity. For the first time in years, no one dictated what was appropriate to read. In the ruins of the German state, ideas were spreading again, fragile, multilingual, unstoppable. And that was precisely the Allied intention, to restore the circulation of thought faster than the machinery of hate could regroup. These three angles reveal the intertwined human and logistical miracle behind a single privilege. Yet more perspective still deepened the meaning. Leadership, enemy mentality, and moral contrast, showing why the Allies made reading an act of deliberate reconstruction. Angle 4, leadership and policy. Freedom by design, the permission to read any book you want, was not accidental. It was the outcome of deliberate Allied and humanitarian planning that stretched back years. In 1943, as Allied leaders prepared for Europe's eventual liberation, they quietly drafted what they called civil reorientation policy. The premise was simple but radical, that the defeat of Nazism would not be complete until minds were free again. Within SHAF, education officers, library associations, and civilian planners met under the Information Services Control Directive. They debated which cultural principles should define the post-war order. Freedom of press and expression topped every list. In Washington, the Office of War Information and the American Library Association had already launched parallel projects, collecting books, coordinating translations, and designing mobile libraries for troops and prisoners alike. The ICRC in Geneva maintained a similar conviction. It argued that intellectual relief, the right to read, write, and learn, was a humanitarian duty equal to food and medicine. Its archives show correspondence where staff pleaded for permission to send textbooks into camps, even when belligerent nations objected. Though the Nazis routinely refused, the persistence of these negotiations ensured that once the Reich collapsed, a framework already existed to restore the free circulation of knowledge. When the Allied military government began operating across occupied Germany in May 1945, it inherited that framework. Directives were issued to reopen schools and libraries as soon as possible. Censorship was to be applied only to Nazi or militarist material. Everything else was to circulate freely. Relief workers described moments when survivors were incredulous and asking, "You mean anything?" And the officers replied, "Anything that was forbidden before." Leadership then was not only military. It was moral. the deliberate decision to make books instruments of peace rather than propaganda. Angle 5. Enemy psychology. The collapse of control to grasp the shock experienced by the liberated women. One must understand the totality of the control system that preceded it. Under the Nazi regime, censorship was not an accessory. It was the bloodstream of the state. From 1933 onward, the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels, dictated every printed word in the Reich. Public book burnings marked the beginning of that rule. Police censorship sustained it. Libraries were purged, writers exiled, schoolbooks rewritten. Reading was transformed from a personal act into a political declaration. Inside concentration camps, literacy itself became a liability. SS overseers often punished those caught writing or hiding text. Some women at Ravensbrück risked their lives to preserve scraps of poetry or letters. Inmates memorized verses from banned authors and whispered them at night as acts of defiance. The written word had become contraband, as dangerous as a weapon. When the Allies entered the camps, that structure collapsed overnight. For the former prisoners, it was not just the physical walls that disappeared, but an entire epistemology, a system that had defined truth through fear. Many survivors later described liberation as a sensory confusion: light, noise, voices in unknown languages, and suddenly, permission. A Red Cross worker noted that some women did not trust the offer of reading material. They expected surveillance, punishment, or hidden conditions. It took time for them to understand that the war for their thoughts had ended. This psychological reversal from censorship to choice marked one of the least visible yet most profound transformations of 45 for the Nazis. Control of information had been the key to obedience. For the Allies, the restoration of choice was the foundation of democracy. Angle 6. The moral and philosophical dimension. Books as a mirror of civilization in the quiet after liberation. When the cameras stopped recording and the nurses turned off the lamps, the meaning of those books became clearer. They were not merely objects of comfort. They were symbols of what had survived. Civilization, at its core, depends on memory. The Nazi project had attempted to erase and rewrite memory, to dictate which ideas could live. The return of books was therefore not only material relief but moral correction, proof that truth could not be permanently silenced. A British officer attached to the Information Services Control later wrote, "We saw that a society learns to murder long before it learns to think, so we gave them books." His words captured the essence of Allied reconstruction, to rebuild nations by restoring minds. For the women in those camps, reading again meant reclaiming agency. To choose a book, whether Tolstoy or a simple grammar, was to assert will, taste, curiosity. It was a small private victory over a system that had erased individuality. And, collectively, those choices became a moral declaration, that humanity's answer to barbarism would not be vengeance, but knowledge. As one historian later observed, the library became the first democratic institution reopened in Germany. Within months, Allied and Red Cross officers helped establish small reading rooms inside displaced persons camps, each stocked with donations from across the world. Survivors volunteered as librarians, cataloging the texts with meticulous care, perhaps because they understood better than anyone the price of lost words. From the perspective of history, the image is almost biblical. In the ashes of totalitarianism, the book returns as the seed of rebirth. The day the gates opened, April 30th, 1945, northern Germany. It began with a sound none of the prisoners recognized, not the bark of a guard dog, not the metallic rattle of boots or gates, but engines. Dozens of them, trucks, jeeps, and ambulances roaring in from the west. The air carried a new rhythm. Hurried, unarmed, human. At Ravensbrück, the women gathered near the fences, thin shapes draped in gray. Some believed it was another transfer. Others feared a massacre. The SS had been abandoning their posts for days, and rumors of execution spread through the barracks. But when the first Red Cross flags appeared, white squares flapping with crimson crosses in the cold wind, silence fell. The guards were gone. Only a handful of foreign medics and Allied officers stood at the entrance now, shouting words that few could understand. "You are free." "It's over." Some women didn't move. They looked at each other, waiting for the trap to spring. It didn't. The men lowered the gates, and for the first time in years, no one shouted, "Halt." The arrival of the convoys by the following day, Allied relief convoys began streaming through the ruins of northern Germany. The roads were lined with wrecked vehicles, abandoned helmets, and the black smoke of distant fires. Yet inside the trucks were crates labeled food, medical supplies, and a few marked simply as books. To many soldiers, the inclusion seemed almost absurd. Books in a landscape where hunger and disease ruled. But for the Red Cross, this was deliberate. The ICRC and the British Red Cross had agreed that psychological recovery began with the restoration of identity. And reading, they argued, was the fastest path back to selfhood. In one convoy diary, Lieutenant Harold Winslow of the British Army wrote, "We distributed bread, then blankets, then books, and only then did they begin to smile. Those crates contained novels, Bibles, poetry anthologies, newspapers, and language primers. They came from donations across Allied nations, parcels sent by civilians who wanted to give something that wasn't just calories or medicine, but meaning. When the women saw the books laid out on tables near the camp square, many approached cautiously as if expecting a trick. A Red Cross nurse recalled one woman asking in broken English, "Are these allowed?" And the nurse, not fully understanding, replied simply, "Of course." The woman stood motionless, then began to cry. Voices of liberation eyewitness accounts vary in tone but share one detail: silence. Liberation was not a loud celebration. It was disbelief turned into stillness. An American relief worker named Margaret Dole, stationed near Bergen-Belsen, described how the women reacted when offered reading materials. One held a book like a newborn. Another traced the letters of her own language with her fingers, as if reminding herself that she could still read. They were skeletal, their eyes enormous. Yet when they looked at those pages, they seemed to breathe differently. In the Ravensbrück camp hospital, survivors began reading aloud, softly, hesitantly, some in Polish, others in French or German. The words filled the barracks, blending languages into a quiet chorus of rediscovered humanity. One group found a children's book among the supplies, Andersen's Fairy Tales. They took turns reading it, passing it hand to hand. For women who had seen death daily, fairy tales were not childish. They were medicine, psychological awakening. The Red Cross doctors soon realized the power of this act. Trauma experts noted that while many survivors refused food or conversation, they responded to stories. Reading aloud calmed tremors, restored sleep, and gave structure to chaos. A field psychiatrist later wrote, "They needed words to reassemble their thoughts. The body had survived, but the mind was fragmented. Reading was their way of remembering how to be human." For the women themselves, this recovery was deeply personal. They had been stripped of names, nationalities, and possessions. But the ability to choose what to read, even for a moment, was an assertion of identity no captor could take away. A French survivor, Simone Albrecht, later told an interviewer, "When I read my first page again, I realized I still existed." They could not erase that. Cultural shock on both sides for Allied soldiers, the sight was just as unforgettable. Many were young, barely 20, unprepared for the scale of what they found. They entered the camps carrying rations and left carrying questions. Private John Weaver of the U.S. Army recorded in his journal, "I gave a woman a book of poems. She kissed it. Not me, the book. I'll never forget that." These moments shifted how soldiers understood victory. It wasn't measured only by captured cities or surrendered divisions, but by the small, fragile return of normal life, a woman reading in sunlight after years of darkness. From survival to rebirth in the days that followed, reading became ritual. Each morning, survivors gathered near the camp fences, sitting in the pale May light, sharing whatever pages they could find. Some translated for others. Some wrote short notes, letters to families, diary entries, prayers. The Red Cross set up makeshift reading stations using wooden crates as tables. They distributed paper and pencils, encouraging survivors to record names, memories, and testimonies. Those fragments later became the first written records of camp life, the seeds of post-war documentation. Within weeks, the camp was reorganized into a displaced person center. The same women who had once hidden scraps of words beneath straw now served as librarians and translators. They cataloged the donated books, arranging them not by language, but by subject, hope, faith, home. As one observer wrote, they built a library on the ruins of a crematorium. Symbol of freedom, that image became iconic. Newsreels captured the sight of women sitting on the ground, reading while Allied medics worked around them. The world saw not only survivors but thinkers, people reclaiming their dignity through the written word. To the liberators, this scene symbolized something deeper than victory. It proved that the human spirit, though imprisoned, had not surrendered its hunger for meaning, and that even after unimaginable cruelty, civilization could still be rebuilt, one page at a time. The day the gates opened, Germany's moral silence was broken not by shouts, but by the sound of paper turning. From camps to classrooms, by June 1945, the war in Europe was over. The guns had fallen silent, but another kind of battle began, the battle to rebuild minds. Across Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, Allied officers and relief workers set up educational rehabilitation centers. These weren't ordinary schools. They were born from the ashes of war, inside old barracks, train depots, and even churches stripped bare by bombing. At first, the students were mostly women, former POWs, slave laborers, and refugees. Many had lost their families and homes. Yet when American officers announced classes in English, typing, and nursing, the response was overwhelming. Hundreds enrolled within days. In one former camp near Lübeck, the Red Cross converted a warehouse into a reading hall. Survivors filled the benches from dawn to dusk. Newspapers in English, French, and Polish circulated hand to hand. For women who had once risked punishment for reading anything, the sight of a bulletin board covered with foreign headlines was almost incomprehensible. A British observer wrote, "They devoured text like bread." Soon, reading clubs emerged, informal gatherings where women translated news articles aloud or discussed novels provided by Allied libraries. For many, these were their first free conversations in years. The camps of death were becoming campuses of learning. Allied policy, re-education as liberation, behind this movement was an official philosophy. The Allies called it denazification, but in practice, it meant something deeper, the moral reconstruction of a civilization. The Information Services Control Division, ISCD, within the U.S. Army, took charge of cultural policy. It banned Nazi authors and propaganda, but opened the gates to every other kind of literature. The same command that had once issued bombing orders now authorized book shipments. Tens of thousands of titles entered Germany under Allied supervision: novels, political essays, science texts, and religious works. American universities sent boxes of literature to re-education libraries, while British publishers offered translated classics. The goal wasn't revenge, it was renewal. In a memo dated August 1945, General Lucius Clay, the U.S. military governor in Germany, wrote, "We cannot rebuild a nation by feeding its body alone. Its soul must be nourished by freedom of thought." That principle reached even the smallest refugee centers. Women who could barely stand were now seen sitting in circles, reading aloud, debating ideas, democracy, justice, peace. For many, these were abstract words once twisted by propaganda. Now they became personal vows. The role of the female mind. The Allies quickly realized something striking. The women were the most eager learners. While many male POWs focused on returning to military or industrial work, female prisoners, and especially those from Eastern Europe and occupied France or the Netherlands, sought education above all else. For years, Nazi ideology had dismissed women as secondary citizens, fit only for obedience or service. Now the liberated women were reversing that script. They studied law, journalism, medicine, subjects once denied to them. One American instructor at a Red Cross school in Frankfurt noted, "They read everything." The hunger was frightening, not for food but for understanding. Some of these women would later become teachers, writers, or activists in post-war Europe. Others helped translate and distribute Allied leaflets about democracy and reconstruction. Their literacy became their weapon, not of destruction, but of transformation. The books that changed the ruins, among the most requested works, were not military manuals or political tracts, but moral and philosophical writings. Tolstoy's War and Peace, the Bible, Shakespeare's plays, Voltaire, Rousseau, and modern essays on freedom and human rights. In the burned-out libraries of Berlin, British officers reopened the American Library Center, one of the first cultural institutions allowed under Allied occupation. Inside, women who had survived the camps volunteered as assistants. They cleaned soot-stained pages, reshelved books, and kept meticulous borrowing records. Every volume represented an act of defiance against the cultural annihilation of the previous regime. The Nazis had once burned these very authors in public squares. Now their words were being read aloud by the very people they tried to silence. A symbol. Spreads. Reading as healing psychologists attached to the Allied Relief Commission began using literature therapy, an experimental idea that reading could rebuild emotional health. They observed that survivors who participated in reading groups showed measurable improvements in stability, communication, and hope. Some hospitals began distributing small pamphlets of poetry and religious texts to patients alongside rations and medicine. The Red Cross called these comfort kits. By late 1946, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, issued a formal directive. Access to free reading material shall be considered an essential element of psychological recovery for displaced persons. From that point, books were officially classified not only as cultural goods, but as humanitarian aid. Freedom beyond the page. The shock of liberation had given way to something steadier. Purpose. The same women who once trembled at the sight of uniforms now volunteered to teach children in the ruins. They turned barracks into classrooms and translated lessons into multiple languages. Their former prison guards were now prisoners themselves, awaiting trial. The moral axis of Europe had inverted. Where hate had once dictated every word, free thought now reigned. A Polish survivor named Danuta Ryba summarized it best in her diary from 1946. "We were not free when the gates opened. We were free when we could read again." The turning point for civilization. That realization marked a global shift in how post-war societies viewed freedom. The Allies had not only defeated tyranny on the battlefield, they had redefined liberation as the right to think, speak, and read without fear. By the end of 1946, more than 2.5 million books had been distributed across occupied Germany and Austria. American soldiers, British educators, and female survivors together created the foundation for post-war Europe's intellectual rebirth. When newsreels filmed those scenes, women reading among ruins, children writing in chalk on broken walls, they became symbols broadcast worldwide. They showed that civilization could rise again, not from factories or weapons, but from pages and pencils. The victory that began with tanks ended with textbooks. The turning point had arrived, but its effects were only beginning to ripple through history. The war was over, yet its moral reconstruction had just begun. The next stage would reveal the deeper consequences, how this freedom to read reshaped lives, nations, and the memory of war itself. The quiet rebuilding of the winter of 1945. Germany had become a continent of ashes. Cities lay flattened, railways twisted into metallic skeletons. Yet in the corners of those ruins, something subtle but profound was happening. People were reading. In a landscape where nothing worked, not the factories, not the governments, not even the churches, the written word became a bridge back to meaning. Everywhere the Allies built relief camps, books followed. What began as an emergency measure soon evolved into policy. Libraries opened in schools, hospitals, and displaced persons (DP) camps. Even in villages without electricity, women gathered by candlelight to read aloud from tattered copies of Les Miserables or Pilgrim's Progress. For female POWs and survivors, this was more than education. It was identity reconstruction. The Nazis had weaponized ignorance. The Allies countered with literacy. Reading was not just a right. It was resistance, redemption, and recovery in one fragile act. From pages to purpose. As months passed, the women who had once been refugees began to take on new roles. Many joined UNRWA, the Red Cross, or local educational councils. They worked as translators, clerks, librarians, and teachers. Their knowledge of languages, German, Polish, Russian, French, English, suddenly became vital. One of them, Eva Breska, a Polish survivor of Ravensbrück, helped found a small reading center in Hanover in 1946. It began with 30 borrowed books. Within a year, it served over 1,000 daily visitors, ex-POWs, widows, orphans, and even former Wehrmacht soldiers seeking instruction in English. For the first time, women stood at the center of rebuilding civic life. In 1947, the Allied military government began recruiting female educators to reopen schools across occupied Germany. Many of those recruited were former prisoners. Their mission was clear: rebuild the moral fabric that tyranny had torn apart. They did not preach ideology. They taught language, logic, and history, the very tools that totalitarianism had sought to destroy. The moral awakening, the ability to read without fear, had a ripple effect. For years, German citizens had lived under censorship so strict that even private diaries could be fatal. When freedom of the press was restored, the psychological shift was immense. Newspapers once silenced now printed words like truth, guilt, and responsibility. Words absent from public life for over a decade. For the women who had seen both sides of the barbed wire, reading these words was bittersweet. Some confronted reports of the Nuremberg trials with disbelief. Others read them aloud, insisting that the world must never forget. A former nurse at Belsen described evenings where survivors read the trial transcripts to each other, tears running down their faces. It was not revenge, she said. It was acknowledgement. The act of reading justice became its own kind of therapy. New institutions, new ideas. By 1948, the Allied powers had established cultural offices in major cities to promote democratic thought. British and American officers worked with German scholars to reopen universities under new charters. Everywhere, the guiding principle remained the same: education as the foundation of peace. The U.S. Information Services began shipping thousands of American books through what was called the Book Bridge program. Titles like The Federalist Papers, Democracy in America, and Common Sense appeared in translation. For the first time, ordinary Europeans read about the principles of liberty from the pens of Jefferson, Madison, and Tocqueville, writers banned for years. In the same years that Europe struggled to rebuild physically, it was quietly reprogramming its moral DNA through words. The right to read freely was no longer an afterthought. It became the backbone of post-war democracy. Freedom carried forward. The story of those women, once prisoners, now teachers and librarians, became symbolic of post-war resilience. In photographs from the late 1940s, they stand beside rows of rebuilt bookshelves, hair still thin, faces still haunted, but eyes alive. A British journalist visiting a DP camp near Hamburg wrote, "They have no mirrors, no furniture, and no shoes that fit, but they have books, and they hold them like passports. Those passports were not just for nations, but for the soul, a crossing from survival into life again." The miracle of post-war Europe was not only that cities rose again, but that thoughts did. From the ashes of oppression, a generation of women proved that liberation of the body means little without liberation of the mind. But as the years went on, the question remained: could this fragile intellectual freedom survive the divisions and politics of a new world, a world entering the Cold War? That question forms the bridge into our next part. The echo spreads. By the late 1940s, the world had changed, but the memory of captivity still pulsed beneath Europe's reconstruction. The liberation of the female POWs had become part of a larger moral narrative, one that shaped the conscience of the modern world. In occupied Germany, France, and Poland, reading circles evolved into civic associations. What began as quiet gatherings of women exchanging borrowed books turned into formal organizations promoting education, cultural restoration, and historical preservation. In Munich, Frauen für Wissen, Women for Knowledge, was founded in 1947 by former camp survivors. Their motto was simple: to read is to resist forgetfulness. That idea spread. Within 2 years, similar groups appeared in France, Czechoslovakia, and the Netherlands, many supported by the UN Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, founded in 1945 with the explicit mission to build peace in the minds of men and women. For the first time in history, literacy was not merely a social goal, it was an ethical one. From camps to charters, The emotional lessons of the camps directly influenced the post-war international order. During the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 1948, several delegates, including women from war-torn nations, argued passionately for the inclusion of cultural and intellectual rights. Article 19, guaranteeing freedom of opinion and expression, and Article 26, declaring the right to education, were born from this moral inheritance. Behind the dry legal language stood lived memories of people who had once been forbidden to read, speak, or even think freely. In testimony to the UN Commission on Human Rights, one Polish delegate, herself a former detainee, stated, "When a regime forbids reading, it forbids humanity. To restore reading is to restore the soul." Her words were not rhetoric. They were remembrance turned into law. The American and Soviet divide, but freedom of the mind would soon face new tests. As the Cold War hardened, Europe once again split along ideological lines. The same allies who had delivered books to liberated camps began restricting them within their own spheres of influence. In Eastern Europe, Soviet authorities imposed censorship on Western literature. In the West, anti-communist purges limited what could be taught or printed. For survivors of Nazi camps, this new censorship felt like a betrayal. One woman, a Czech librarian who had rebuilt a reading center with UNRWA help, wrote bitterly in her diary in 1949, "They told us to read freely. Now they tell us what to read again. The faces change, but the silence feels the same." The irony was sharp and tragic. The very freedom the Allies had, championed, was now contested by the powers they had become. Yet the memory of that first freedom, those first days when books were handed to the newly liberated, endured as a quiet resistance. Underground libraries appeared in Soviet-occupied zones, often run by the same women who had once been POWs. Hidden behind walls or beneath floorboards, they preserved banned works and circulated them secretly, keeping alive the idea that no government, no ideology, could fully control the written word. Memory becomes legacy. By the 1950s, Europe's reconstruction had matured into remembrance. Museums, archives, and memorial foundations were established across Germany and Poland, many led by women who had lived through the camps. Their goal was to ensure that the story of intellectual and moral rebirth would never fade behind statistics and politics. In 1954, the Ravensbrück Memorial Library opened, curated by survivors. Its shelves held works by those once forbidden: Jewish, Slavic, political, pacifist, and feminist writers. At the entrance stood a small plaque etched with a sentence simple yet eternal: "They took our books away. We took them back." This inscription became a symbol not just of one camp, but of an entire generation that had reclaimed its voice. The same spirit inspired educational reforms worldwide. Nations emerging from colonial rule in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East cited post-war Europe's intellectual liberation as a model for their own struggles. Freedom of thought, once a Western ideal, had become a universal demand. The psychological victory psychiatrists studying post-war trauma began to note something extraordinary. While physical scars endured, survivors who re-engaged with learning, reading, writing, teaching, showed significantly higher long-term resilience. Dr. Henry Cohen, a French neuropsychologist working with female survivors, summarized his findings in 1953. The restoration of choice, granting the power to select what one reads, reactivates autonomy. It is the moment when captivity truly ends. Freedom, in other words, was not merely the absence of chains, but the return of curiosity. Full circle. By the time the 1950s turned to the 1960s, most of the women liberated in 1945 were middle-aged. Some had families. Others worked in universities or relief organizations. Yet nearly all kept one memento from those early days: a single book or page from a camp reading hall, preserved like a relic. When interviewed decades later, they spoke not of revenge or hatred but of rediscovery. One former prisoner said quietly, "They gave us bread for the body, but the book that fed the soul." That moment, repeated thousands of times across liberated Europe, became more than an act of charity. It was the turning point in modern civilization's conscience, the proof that ideas, not weapons, define humanity's endurance. The story of those women does not end in the ashes of 1945. It continues wherever the right to think freely is defended, wherever a book, once forbidden, is opened again under the light of peace. Soft orchestral music rises, strings over faint wind. In every war, there are victors and vanquished. But after the Second World War, the women who once lived behind barbed wire discovered another kind of victory, one not won by armies, but by memory. They had been stripped of everything, names, homes, dignity, even the right to speak their own language. And yet what they reclaimed was far greater: the freedom to think, the freedom to learn, the freedom to read. As Europe rebuilt its cities from ruins, these women rebuilt something deeper: the invisible architecture of conscience. In their classrooms, libraries, and living rooms, they restored a civilization's heartbeat, word by word, page by page. Archival footage, survivors in gray coats walking through snow, slow dissolve to open books under sunlight. One can still find their notes in museum archives, handwriting fragile as smoke, yet fierce with life. Margins filled with questions, sketches, translations, even small poems written on ration paper. Each line whispers the same defiance. You tried to silence us. Instead, we learned to listen. That quiet defiance became the world's inheritance. From the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to every child opening a school book today, echoes of that moment remain. Proof that literacy is not luxury, but liberty. Music deepens. Narration softens. When we open a book, we do more than read. We enter the same covenant they once fought to preserve. The belief that knowledge is sacred, that curiosity is strength, that truth cannot be burned or buried. And so, the story of the women who read in the dark ends not in despair, but in light. The same faint light that once glowed through cracks in barrack walls, guiding hands that turned forbidden pages, because in the end, civilization survives not through power, but through remembrance. Final shot, a single candle beside an open book, its pages fluttering in a soft wind. Fade to black. Title card. Dedicated to all who kept the light of knowledge alive, even in darkness.